Python environment variables. These environment variables influence Python's behavior. They are processed before the command line switches, other than -e or -i mode. It is customary that command line switches override environmental variables where there is a conflict. Python home. Change the location of the standard Python libraries. By default, the libraries are searched in prefix /lib /python version and exec underscore prefix /lib /python version, where prefix and exec prefix are installation dependent directories, both defaulting to user /local. When Python home is set to a single directory, its value replaces both prefix and exec underscore prefix. To specify different values for these, set Python home to prefix colon exec underscore prefix. Python path. Augment the default search path for module files. The format is the same as the shell's path. One or more directory Python names separated by os.path separator. Example colons on Unix or semicolons on Windows. Non-existent directories are silently ignored. In addition to normal directories, individual Python path entries may refer to zip files containing pure Python modules in either source or compiled form. Extension modules cannot be imported from zip files. The default search path is installation dependent but generally begins with prefix /lib /python version. See Python home above. It is always appended to Python path. An additional directory will be inserted in the search path in front of Python path as described above under interface options. The search path can be manipulated from within a Python program as the variable sys.path. Python safe path. If this is set to a non-empty string, don't prepend a potentially unsafe path to sys.path. See the -p option for detail. Python plate lib directory. If this is set to a non-empty string, it overrides the sys.plate lib directory value. Python on startup. If this is the name of a readable file, the Python commands in that file are executed before the first prompt is displayed in interactive mode. The file is executed in the same namespace where interactive commands are executed so that objects defined or imported in it can be used without qualification in the interactive session. You can also change the prompts sys.ps1 and sys.ps2 and the hook sys. Interactive hook __ in this file. Raises an auditing event. See python.run _ startup with the file name as the argument when called on startup. Python optimize. If this is set to a non-empty string, it is equivalent to specifying the -0 option. If set to an integer, it is equivalent to specifying -0 multiple times. Python breakpoint. If this is set, it names a callable using dotted path notation. The module containing the callable will be imported and then the callable will be run by default implementation of sys.breakpoint hook bracket, which itself is called by default in breakpoint bracket dot. If not set or set to the empty string, it is equivalent to the value pdb dot set underscore trace dot settings. This to the 0 causes the default implementation of sys.breakpoint to do nothing but return immediately. Python debug. If this is set to a non-empty string, it is equivalent to specifying the -d option. If set to an integer, it is equivalent to specifying -d multiple times. This environment variable requires a debug built for Python, otherwise it's ignored. Python inspect. If this is set to a non-empty string, it is equivalent to specifying the -i option. This variable can also be used modified by Python code using os.environ to force inspect mode on program termination. Python unbuffered. If this is set to a non-empty string, it is equivalent to specifying the "-u option. Python verbose. If this is set to a non-empty string, it is equivalent to specifying the "-v option. If set to an integer, it is equivalent to specifying "-v multiple times. Python case OK. If this is set, Python ignores case in import statements. This only works on Windows and Mac OS. Python don't write bytecode. If this is set to an empty string, Python won't try to write .pyc files on the import of source modules. This is equivalent to specifying the "-B option. Python pycatch prefix. If this is set, Python will write .pyc files in a mirror directory tree at this path instead of in underscore underscore pycatch underscore underscore directories within the source tree. This is equivalent to specifying the -x pycatch underscore prefix is equal to path option. Python has seed. If this variable is not set or set to random, a random value is used to seed the hashes or str and byte objects. If Python has seed is set to an integer value, it is used as a fixed seed for generating the hash of the types covered by the hash randomization. Its purpose is to allow repeatable hashing, such as for self tests for the interpreter itself, or to allow a cluster of Python processes to share hash values. The integer must be a decimal number in the range 0429496795. Specifying the value 0 will disable hash randomization. Python integer max str digits. If this variable is set to an integer, it is used to configure the interpreter's global integer string conversation length limitation. Python OE encoding. Python IO encoding. If this is set before running the interpreter, it overrides the encoding used for stdin slash stdout slash stdr in the syntax encoding name colon error handler. Both the encoding name and the error handler parts are optional and have the same meaning as in str.encode. For stderr, the colon err handler part is ignored. The handler will always be backslash replace. Python Python no use user site. If this is set, Python won't add the user site packages directory to sys.path. Python user base. Define the user base directory which is used to compute the path of the user site package directory and installation. For Python -p pip install --user. Python executable. If this environment variable is set, sys.argv0 will be set to its value instead of the value got through the C runtime. Only works on Mac OS. Python warnings. This is equivalent to the -w option. If set to a comma separated string, it is equivalent to specifying -w multiple times with filters later in the list taking precedence over those earlier in the list. The simplest settings apply a particular action unconditionally to all warnings emitted by a process, even those that are otherwise ignored by default. Python warnings equal to default warn once per call location. Python warnings is equal to error convert to exceptions. Python warnings is equal to always warn every time. Python warnings is equal to module warn once per calling module. Python warnings is equal to once warn once per Python process. Python warnings is equal to ignore never warn. Python Python fault handler. If this environment variable is set to a non-empty string, fault handler.enable is called at startup. Install a handler sig sagv, sig fpe, sig abrt, sig bus, or and sig signals to dump the Python trace bag. This is equivalent to -x fault handler option. Python trace malloc. If this environment variable is set to a non-empty string, start tracing Python memory allocations using the trace malloc module. The value of the variable is the maximum number of frames stored in a trace bag of a trace. For example, Python trace alloc is equal to 1 stores only the most recent frame. See the trace malloc.start function for more information. This is equivalent to setting the -x trace malloc option. Python profile import time. If this environment variable is set to a non-empty string, Python will show how long each import takes. This is equivalent to setting the -x import time option. Python async debug. If this environment variable is set to a non-empty string, enable the debug mode on the async IO module. Python malloc. Set the Python memory allocators and to or install debug hooks. Set the family of memory allocators used by Python. Default. Use the default memory allocators. Malloc. Use the malloc function of the C library for all domains. Pymem underscore domain underscore row. Pymem underscore domain underscore mem. Pymem underscore domain underscore object. Pymalloc. Use the pymalloc allocator for pymem underscore domain underscore mem and pymem underscore domain underscore object domains, and use the malloc function for the pymem underscore domain underscore row domain. Install debug hooks. Debug. Install debug hooks on top of the default memory allocators. Malloc underscore debug. Same as malloc but also install debug hooks. Pymalloc underscore debug. Same as pymalloc but also install debug hooks. Python malloc states. If set to a non-empty string, Python will print statistics of the pymalloc and memory allocator every time a new pymalloc object arena is created and on shutdown. This variable is ignored if the Python malloc environment variable is used to force the malloc allocator of the C library, or if Python is configured without pymalloc support. Python legacy uh, Windows FS encoding. If set to a non-empty string, the default Py file system encoding and error handler mode will revert to their pre 3.6 values of MBCS and replace respectively. Otherwise, the new defaults UTF-8 and surrogate pass are used. Python legacy Windows stdio. If set to a non-empty string, does not use the new console reader and writer. This means that Unicode characters will be encoded according to the active console code page rather than using UTF-8. This variable is ignored if the standard strings are redirected to files or pipes rather than referring to console buffers. Python coerce local. If set to value 0, causes the main Python command line application to skip coercing the legacy ASCII based C and POSIX locales to a more capable UTF-8 based alternatives. If this variable is not set or is set to a value other than 0, the lc underscore all local override environment variable is also not set, and the current locale reported for the lc underscore c type category is either the default C locale or else the explicitly ASCII based POSIX locale. Then the Python CLI will attempt to configure the following locales for the lc underscore c type category in the order listed before loading interpreter runtime. C.UTF-8, C.UTF-8, UTF-8. If setting one of these local categories succeeds, then the lc underscore c type environment variable will also be set accordingly in the current process environment before the Python runtime is initialized. This ensures that in addition to being seen by both the interpreter itself and other local aware components running in the same process, such as GNU readline library, the updated setting is also seen in subprocesses regardless of whether or not those processes are running a Python interpreter, as well as in operations that query the environment rather than the current C locale, such as Python's own locale.getDefault locale. Configuring one of these locales either explicitly or via the above implicit locale coercion automatically enables the surrogates escape error handler for std sys.stdin and sys.stdout. Sys.stdr continues to use backslash replace as it does in any other locale. This stream handling behavior can be overridden using Python IO encoding as well. For debugging purposes, setting Python coerce local is equal to 1 will cause Python to emit warning messages on stdr if either the local coercion activates or else if a local that would trigger coercion is still active when the Python runtime is initialized. Also note that even when local coercion is disabled or when it fails to find a suitable target locale, Python UTF-8 will still activate by default legacy ASCII based locales. Both features must be disabled in order to force the interpreter to use ASCII instead of UTF-8 for system interfaces. Python dev mode. If this environment variable is set to a non-empty string, enable Python development mode, introducing additional runtime checks that are too expensive to be enabled by default. This is equivalent to setting the -x dev option. Python UTF-8. If set to 1, enable the Python UTF mode. If set to 0, disable the Python UTF mode. Setting any other non-empty string causes an error during interpreter initialization. Python warn default encoding. If this environment variable is set to a non-empty string, issues an encoding warning when the local specific default encoding is used. Python debug ranges. If this variable is set, it disables the inclusion of the tables mapping extra location information and line start column offset and end column offset to every instruction in code objects. This is useful when smaller code objects and PYC files are desired, as well as suppressing the extra visual location indicators when the interpreter disables tracebacks. Python perf support. If this variable is set to a non-zero value, it enables support for the Linux perf profiler, so Python calls can be detected by it. If set to 0, disable Linux perf profiler support. See also -x perf command line option and Python support for the Linux perf profiler. Debug mode variables. Python dump preference. If set, Python will dump objects and reference counts still alive after shutting down the interpreter. Python dump preference file is equal to file name. If set, Python will dump objects and references counts still alive after shutting down the interpreter into a file called file name. Need Python configured with -with -trace reference build option.